Hello and welcome to Thinkermaker. In this episode we're going to explore how care is being squashed by a growing litigation culture combined with the data is king culture. Again, we start with a bit of recent history. So back in the 90s, when new bottom line driven managers were brought in to shift focus onto costs, they got a foolhardy idea to make a bit of extra change. They noticed that sometimes patients like this fellow with a bump on his head, not sick enough to admit, are sent home from A&E with an advice card, like this one for head injury. And they figured out it would make sense to sell advertising space on the reverse side of the card to make a quick buck. And who do you think bought the space? Of course, lawyers, ambulance chasers, encouraging litigation and also diluting the good spirit of forgiveness. And here's one from Dudley, NHS Trust. Now, wind the clock forward just 2 decades and surprise, surprise, the forgiving society which once characterised British culture has vanished under a deluge of litigation culture, and the NHS is paying huge sums for lawyers. These days, NHS legal teams can even be found litigating against the NHS's own medical staff. Pause and read this. The litigation costs are enough to train 6,500 doctors. So now, instead of building a positive, hopeful and confident mindset in patients, which is known to boost healing, we have doctors on the defensive. To protect themselves, they highlight every possible risk in treatments which makes people feel anxious. And how do you objectively measure anxiety or hope? Hey? Using an electric meter? No! There is no device. A caring, hopeful explanation is an unmeasurable thing. The litigation culture sabotages it. The fact is that business managers and politicians had transformed the NHS into an organisation legally required to be exclusively evidence-based, metrics obsessed and secular, but keeping emotions out. Can you believe that? Healthcare without emphasis on emotions just because they can't be measured. It was all about counting things. The bias in favour of measurable things over unmeasurable things has led to such singular focus on material science that it pulverised caringness. It's an epic and ongoing mistake to this day. It spawned a bureaucracy drowning in policies and procedures of an extremely risk-averse culture. And those policies are seen as essential training for medics, sometimes ahead of the medicine itself. And more high expectations. Complaints must receive written response in 3 days. Where is the supply of hours for clinical staff to do this admin? Now, this document is today's manager's NHS long-term plan. 136 pages long. Guess how many times it mentions emotional needs? I'll tell you. Only once on page 42. So that idea backfired royally. Now, the public feel entitled to litigate against a well-meaning service trying to be free at the point of need. Hello? We've just destroyed a very fine aspect of decency in British culture, but that's not all. In 1986, nurse training switched away from ward-based vocation with emphasis on care and compassion into classrooms with the new Project 2000 evidence-based nurse training program. You see, evidence-based. There's that metrics mania creeping in. The Nursing Times reported that training shifted focus to scientific knowledge over bedside skill. Student nurse recruitment started prioritising academic intelligence over an empathic patient temperament. Pause and read this. Unmeasurable things like empathy got deprioritised, and many protested at the time. Some called it a dreadful mistake. Care and compassion were not only being sidelined from the equation in management, but also clinical training. Nurses were chosen for having brains, not for just having a heart. And people were feeling it. Again, pause and read these press-cutting highlights from 2011. What's more, those with a naturally empathic and caring temperament got frustrated with bureaucracy and data collection, which left no time or energy to be loving. And the outcome, gone. The care aspect in healthcare was unrewarded and has shrunk drastically. So, with too many staff feeling indifferent, oops! Here's some more cuttings from 2012 making the same point. So pause to read if you wish. I'll just point out the highlighted bits about loss of care and dignity. I repeat, business managers and politicians have transformed the NHS into an exclusively evidence-based, metrics-obsessed, secular organisation, an epic and ongoing mistake to this day. Now let me show you more recent examples. Remember this, the Staffordshire hospital scandal, hundreds of needless deaths. The Trust chief executive admitted a lack of care, lack of compassion, lack of dignity, and all of those unmeasurable things. And why? A targets culture focused on whatever can be measured, financials, waiting times. That's the problem. Measurable things have become more important than unmeasurable values. That's the metrics mania. At an MP's inquiry, even the NHS boss admitted that metrics mania, focusing on targets, a narrow definition of accountability, anything measurable, waiting times, infection rates. And the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, he also says it, the targets culture, metrics mania. We are in a cult of data worship, but not emotions. Why? You can't measure them. And even as recently as 2020, it is still going on. How many people lost loved ones in the pandemic without the opportunity to say goodbye? A World War veteran died alone without his family. How do you measure that grief, that negative emotion? Is there anything more these management guys could do to really kick the boot into care? Well, believe it or not, yes, there is. Here's a true and typical story. It tells how cost cutting to squeeze the last penny out of the A&E at a London hospital destroyed staff morale. And note, morale is not measurable, not in the data, not in the financials. Typically, the A&E staff common room looked like this. There was always a lot of camaraderie and love amongst the staff for each other. So at Christmas, it would be decorated, and the canteen chefs took pride and joy in preparing a full Christmas dinner with trimmings for the A&E staff. They paraded it down to the common room with some fanfare. And they'd leave it on the table for A&E doctors and nurses to enjoy whenever they could catch a few minutes. We're talking no more than about £50 worth of food here. But in the mid-90s, being ruthlessly bottom-line driven, managers decided to cut that cost and replace that love-filled morale-building Christmas dinner with sandwich, crisps and a biscuit. This period ushered the beginning of a decades-long decline in staff morale by 1,000 little cuts. In the next episode, we'll see how that destruction of morale has caused staff to become tired, numb, indifferent, robotic and stressed, or even to leave the NHS altogether. Thank you for watching.